The Baltic Gambit, how Ukraine crippled Russia's oil empire with a 200mm masterstroke. In the early hours of September 12, 2025, silence blanketed the Primorsk Oil Port along Russia's Baltic coastline. Two colossal tankers, vessels worth hundreds of millions, sat motionless beneath the pale moonlight, their hulls heavy with liquid gold. Millions of barrels of crude oil awaited transfer, destined for markets across the globe. The crew aboard these ships had no idea they were about to become targets in one of the most audacious military operations of the modern era. What unfolded that night wasn't just an attack. It was a symphony of deception, precision, and technological warfare, a carefully orchestrated operation that would expose the vulnerabilities of one of the world's most formidable air defense networks. This is the story of how Ukraine turned Russia's greatest strength into its greatest weakness. At exactly 12:25 in the morning, hundreds of kilometers south of the Baltic coast, something inexplicable appeared on the screens of Russian operators. Inside a fortified command center, technicians monitoring the Nebo-M long-range VHF radar system stared in disbelief as their displays erupted with hostile contacts. More than 70 unidentified signatures, low radar cross-sections, approaching fast. The threat extended across a 1,000-kilometer front, carrying a combined explosive payload exceeding 3 tons. This wasn't a probe. This wasn't a test. This was an invasion force descending upon Russian airspace. Within minutes, confirmation arrived from the 91N6E Big Bird Wide Area Surveillance Radar. The alarm klaxons began their haunting wail throughout the Leningrad Oblast Air Defense Command Center. Officers scrambled to their stations, their training kicking in with mechanical precision. Russian generals deep within their fortified bunkers remained calm. This was the moment their systems had been engineered for. Years of investment, billions of rubles, countless drills, all leading to this. Russia's 3-tier integrated air defense network activated with lethal efficiency. Around St. Petersburg, S-400 batteries came alive, their 92N6E gravestone engagement radars painting targets across the night sky, locking on one by one. At lower altitudes, Panzer S-1 systems prepared to unleash devastation, their twin 2A-38M 30mm cannons capable of spewing 5,000 rounds per minute into approaching threats. The Russians believed they were witnessing a desperate, ill-conceived assault. They were wrong. What they faced was something far more dangerous, a meticulously planned deception, months in the making, designed to exploit every weakness in their defensive architecture. The groundwork for this operation had been laid weeks earlier in a nondescript planning facility in Kyiv. Ukrainian military strategists faced a seemingly impossible challenge. Strike a target 1,000 kilometers deep inside Russian territory, protected by one of the most sophisticated air defense networks on Earth. An area NATO analysts classified as an anti-access/area denial bubble. The solution they devised was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. While Russian operators focused on the approaching swarm, they failed to recognize the pattern. The drones weren't randomly distributed, they were geographically precise, each wave calibrated to trigger specific defensive responses. Decoy formations deliberately targeted the villages of Zelenogorsk, Tozno, Pavlovsk, and Usmino, as well as the Lomonosov district within Leningrad Oblast. Simultaneously, separate waves struck toward Vsevolozhsk, Tosnensky, Gachinsky, Lomonosovsky, and Pushkinsky districts surrounding St. Petersburg itself. The effect was catastrophic for Russian situational awareness. Their most powerful S-400 batteries swiveled toward these incoming threats, prioritizing population centers and strategic infrastructure. The defensive umbrella that should have covered Primorsk Port was systematically peeled away, layer by layer. In a shelter near Gachinsky, a young Russian lieutenant watched the final target in his sector vanish from his screen. Relief washed over him as he transmitted his routine report upward through the chain of command. Sector clear. All targets eliminated. That report, climbing through layers of military bureaucracy, would lead generals to commit the gravest error of their careers. What they interpreted as victory was actually the closing of a trap. The Ukrainian plan allocated more than 70 drones to the Leningrad and St. Petersburg regions. Of these, 35 AQ-400 Scythe drones served a single purpose: draw Russian attention towards St. Petersburg. These expendable platforms were sacrificial pawns, meant to die spectacular deaths while accomplishing their true mission. deception. The remaining 40 drones formed the primary strike force, scattered across Leningrad Oblast in a deadly constellation. At the heart of this formation lurked 15 UJ-26 Bober ER drones, the assassination squad tasked with annihilating Primorsk Port. Success hinged on mathematical precision. Enough of the 40 decoy drones had to penetrate Russia's defensive fire to create chaos. Meanwhile, the core strike element had to slip through undetected, surviving a gauntlet of overlapping radar coverage and missile batteries. Every component of this operation had been carefully selected. Standard Bober drones lacked the range for such an ambitious mission, but the ER variants, extended range, were different beasts entirely. Equipped with supplementary fuel tanks and optimized engine management software, these platforms could complete a 1,000-kilometer one-way flight while carrying 40-kilogram warheads. Supporting them were electronic warfare drones designated Banshee 7. These specialized platforms were built on the same extended-range airframe as the Bober ER, but instead of explosives, they carried advanced jamming pods and sophisticated antenna arrays. Their mission? Escort the strike package across 1,000 kilometers of hostile territory, disrupting enemy radar and communications at critical moments. The AQ-400 Scythe drones chosen as decoys were masterpieces of simplicity. Their plywood construction provided minimal radar signature while enabling rapid, cost-effective mass production. Hundreds could be manufactured quickly, creating the numerical superiority necessary for a saturation attack. As midnight passed, more than 70 drones lifted off from concealed locations across Ukraine. Flying at extreme low altitude, they began their infiltration of Russian airspace, maintaining absolute radio silence. The first hours of flight were a testament to autonomous navigation technology. Preloaded digital terrain maps guided each drone through the darkness, following riverbeds and forested corridors, hugging the Earth to remain below Russian radar coverage. It was an exhausting test of each platform's guidance system. Some didn't make it. Several drones crashed into terrain features or suffered mechanical failures during this punishing low-level flight. These losses had been anticipated. Acceptable casualties factored into the operational planning from the beginning. Once the formation crossed into Russian territory, the rules changed. Stealth became secondary. Now, survival depended on managing the chaos. When Russian air defense networks finally awoke, they reacted exactly as Ukrainian planners had predicted. The 91-6E Big Bird radars detected the massive, dispersed swarm approaching from hundreds of kilometers away. Automated threat assessment algorithms immediately prioritized the cluster deemed most dangerous, the 35 Scythe drones heading for St. Petersburg. Massive 48N6 missiles erupted from S-400 launchers, hunting down these cheap plywood targets one after another. To Russian operators, this represented textbook defensive success. To Ukrainian strategists, it was the first sacrifice in a deadly game of chess. Meanwhile, the 40 drones scattered across the Leningrad countryside began their lethal dance with Panzer and Buk systems. Near Vsevolozhsk, a Panzer S-1 battery achieved radar lock on a low-flying UJ-26 Bober. The 1RS-2-1E tracking radar had captured the target perfectly, displaying all telemetry data on the fire control console. But the Ukrainian operator watching from hundreds of kilometers away could also see that radar lock and knew exactly what to do. A nearby Banshee 7 had already detected the Panzer's X-band frequency. Within seconds, it transmitted a powerful jamming signal on the same wavelength. The Russian operator's screen went completely white, lock broken. In desperation, he unleashed the 2A-38M cannons, filling the sky with a wall of 30mm rounds. But the Bober had already slipped through the barrage, disappearing into the darkness beyond. This scenario repeated itself throughout the night, a technological duel playing out at multiple locations simultaneously. Russian determination was fierce, their firepower overwhelming. Across Leningrad Oblast, they succeeded in destroying 33 drones, turning them into flaming wreckage that littered the countryside. Every drone heading towards central St. Petersburg was obliterated, exactly as planned. For Ukraine, these were not failures, they were investments. Each fallen drone created an opportunity for another to slip through behind it. Each explosion drew attention away from the real threat. And in the blind spot created by all that fire and fury, 7 specially modified UJ-26 Bober ER drones breached the primary defensive line. 7 surgical scalpels, each carrying a 40-kilogram armor-piercing warhead, now streaked toward the economic heart of Russia. The generals in their bunkers, studying only the corner of a vast canvas shown to them, were about to miss the entire picture. At 4:45 in the morning, the Panzer battery defending Primorsk Port jerked to life as 7 small signatures materialized on its screens, closing rapidly. Panic set in. 57 E-6 missiles launched from their tubes in desperation, but the targets were too low, too fast, too close. The 7 Bober drones executed their final maneuver above the port, splitting into 2 coordinated groups. 3 veered toward the pumping station, the port's vital heart. The Panzer missiles managed to intercept 1 drone just hundreds of meters from impact. It was Russia's last victory that night. The remaining 2 Bobers dove to complete their mission. The first, carrying a TBG-7V thermobaric warhead, slammed into the station's main control building. The explosion consumed every molecule of oxygen in the enclosed space, generating a massive pressure wave that blew the structure's walls outward like tissue paper. Seconds later, the second drone plunged into the main pipeline manifold. The explosion severed the port's lifelines in an instant. Simultaneously, the 4 remaining bobbers locked onto the 2 tankers waiting at the pier. The first pair targeted the Captain Lob. 1 drone equipped with a KZ-6-shaped explosive charge struck just below the bridge, obliterating all electronic systems. The second impacted a main cargo tank filled with crude oil, igniting a massive conflagration. The other 2 Bobers engaged the Sergei Gorshkov. The strikes were devastatingly precise, one targeting the engine room, the other the loading manifolds. 4 of the UAVs had struck 2 Aphroax-class tankers belonging to Russia's Shadow Fleet, the Kusto and the Kailun. The Kusto, managed by Solstice Corp, carried a deadweight tonnage of 115,000. The Kailun, registered to Axironics Limited, operated at 110,000 WT. Both vessels sailed under suspicious flags, their ownership obscured through layers of shell companies, standard practice for ships designed to circumvent international sanctions. At the moment of attack, both tankers were completing their loading operations. When the drones arrived, they were nearly full. That's when the fires began. The scale of the inferno wasn't merely tactical, it was strategic. The impact points weren't just storage tanks, but the critical infrastructure of the shipping station itself. 42 seconds after the first explosion, the second detonation collapsed Primorsk Port's No. 2 pumping station. The third Doctor, one pierced the upper facade of the port's control center. Short circuits cascaded through the electrical systems, triggering an emergency shutdown sequence across the entire facility. But the shutdown command never propagated through the network, because the core of the energy control system had also been destroyed. Drones 4 and 5 targeted the loading arms at the sterns of both tankers. Fire erupted aboard the Kusto, fuel began hemorrhaging from the Kailun. The 6th and 7th strikes hit the pump valve areas. After these final impacts, controlling the fires became impossible. Primorsk was evaporating. Within minutes, Primorsk Port resembled a vision of hell. 2 massive tankers engulfed in flames, a devastated pumping station, infrastructure crumbling under the weight of destruction. Hours after the attack, the Russian Defense Ministry issued a statement claiming that 221 Ukrainian drones had been shot down across the country overnight, declaring all attacks successfully repelled. These figures rang hollow against satellite imagery from Primorsk, which revealed billions of dollars in damage. The targets had been chosen with surgical precision. Primorsk alone handled approximately 20% of Russia's seaborne oil exports. The Aphroax-class tankers, each capable of carrying roughly 700,000 barrels of oil, were critical vessels in the Shadow Fleet used to circumvent Western sanctions. The port facilitated $15 billion in annual oil export value. It served as the gateway for barrel-based oil shipments difficult to track and even harder to control, sold to international shadow fleets operating in legal gray zones. Closing this gateway directly impacted Russia's war funding. With average daily shipments of 1 million barrels, the disruption translated to approximately $70 to $80 million in daily losses. That same morning, St. Petersburg's Pulkovo Airport activated emergency protocols. 11 aircraft were diverted to alternate airports. The simultaneous entry of numerous UAVs into the airspace pushed civil and military air traffic management into crisis mode. When safety reflexes triggered from radar and tower perspectives, operations automatically broke down. Data from the Leningrad Regional Administration and airport operators confirmed what military officials already knew. Their defensive posture had been fundamentally compromised. A cluttered picture over St. Petersburg, UAV wreckage scattered across the Leningrad Countess. Tri-side, debris falling outside residential areas. All of this kept operators' attention focused upward while the strike wave approaching from the sea horizon locked onto the terminal. From a technical standpoint, Ukraine's long-range UAV concept achieved three critical objectives in this mission. First, it eliminated range calculation errors through the use of two distinct drone classes, each optimized for specific roles within the operation. Second, it exploited a fundamental weakness in Russian air defense doctrine. Russian systems had been optimized to stop small numbers of high-technology targets, cruise missiles, stealth. In other words, Ukrainian forces succeeded by gathering accurate intelligence and selecting the optimal time window for exploitation. The attack originated externally, penetrated deeply, and incinerated everything at its core. On paper, Russia's defensive umbrella in the region appeared formidable. In practice, when combined with low-altitude approaches, sea-skimming trajectories, and synchronized false target clutter, it proved vulnerable during brief operational windows. This was the reality on the morning of September 12th. The radars were operational, the defensive systems responded as designed, but the configuration proved inadequate to prevent low-profile drones from infiltrating the terminal. Flying low, skimming the sea horizon, entering the line of sight of fixed antennas only in final moments. This geometry forces even top-tier systems like the S-400 into a race against time. By the moment radar detection occurs, the threat is already upon you. The fact that bombers flew at extreme low altitude meant that, due to Earth's curvature, even the powerful 91 and 6E Big Bird radars could detect them only in the terminal phase, and for a very brief duration. This narrow window proved insufficient for effective interception. The dozens of destruction reports across the aerial picture produced nothing more than temporary closure decisions and district-by-district siren activations above St. Petersburg. The outcome wasn't merely a few hours of fire, it was operational suspension and shadow fleet losses documented for the first time, with simultaneous fires aboard two vessels. This operation revealed a fundamental truth about modern warfare. Conflicts are no longer won solely by those possessing the most expensive weapon systems, but by those who deploy their capabilities with intelligence, audacity, and creativity. On that September night, Ukraine demonstrated to the world how to bring a superpower to its knees with a gambit extending across 1,000 kilometers. It was a lesson in asymmetric warfare, in technological innovation, and in the enduring power of human ingenuity over raw military might. The fires at Primorsk Port burned for days, but the message they sent burned far longer. If you found this deep dive into one of the most sophisticated military operations of our time compelling, make sure to subscribe to IntelX, where we bring you the untold stories behind global conflicts, cutting-edge military technology, and the strategic chess matches shaping our world. Aircraft, precision munitions. Ukraine's swarm tactics overwhelmed the decision-making mechanisms through target saturation. Third, the success of electronic warfare platforms like the Banshee 7 didn't require completely blinding Russian radars. Instead, they presented operators with so many false targets and interference patterns that distinguishing real threats became impossible. Traces of such systems were discovered among drone debris captured around St. Petersburg. Components found in Usmano and Pavlovsk indicated navigation software designed specifically for deception, platforms built not to strike, but to mislead. This deception rendered the actual strike point invisible. Confirmation came when images of the fires spread across social media. The conflagration couldn't be contained, and official statements that followed left authorities no choice but to acknowledge the attack. Moreover, on a morning when Primorsk operated at full capacity, Russian command failed to anticipate the assault. The port had been considered deep, well-protected, and virtually invulnerable. Despite the presence of formidable military units, the 6th Combined Arms Army in Leningrad, the 2nd Independent Motorized Division, and Baltic Fleet Headquarters, a defensive weakness existed. These units maintained primarily western-facing postures oriented toward NATO threats from across the Baltic. They were looking outward, not inward. Russian officers had never anticipated this scenario. The naval base at Kronstadt, artillery and rocket units along the Luga line, air defense grids around Lomonosov, command and control infrastructure along the Gachina-Pushkin-Kolpino corridor, this entire network had operated under a standard threat model for 3 years, with processes calibrated for threats originating from the south and east. A drone attack penetrating deep enough to close a major port on the Baltic coast had been deemed unlikely under existing threat assessments. Shift changes and the simultaneous activation of coastal surveillance bands created small delays in response times. When these factors converged, a decisive window of opportunity emerged around the terminal. The real surprise wasn't that Russian officers failed to focus on the main target. It was that the surrounding diversionary attacks so effectively clouded the operational picture while the strike hit its target with precision. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us as we continue uncovering the intelligence behind the headlines. This is IntelX, where strategy meets reality.